In 1967, the president of ABC Records sat across from Louis Armstrong and told him he would not promote the record. The song was too simple for the market that year. The arrangements were old-fashioned. Armstrong was 66 years old, and the music industry of 1967 was not, in most of its commercial calculations, looking for what a 66-year-old trumpet player had to offer. Larry Newton, the ABC Records executive who made this decision, was not being personally unkind. He was being commercially practical, in the way that record label executives are commercially practical, assessing the market as he understood it, and making the determination that what Armstrong had recorded did not fit where that market was going. Armstrong had recorded the song anyway. He had recorded it because he believed in it, in the particular way that musicians believe in certain material, not with calculation or strategy, but with a certainty that precedes argument. The year 1967 was not, on its surface, a promising moment for the kind of song that Armstrong had recorded. The music industry was moving at speed in directions that had little to do with the formal, orchestrated quality of what Armstrong's producer Bob Thiele had brought him. Rock and soul were the commercial centers of gravity. The Beatles had released Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band that same year. Aretha Franklin was in the middle of the most commercially successful period of her career. The cultural conversation about music in 1967 was happening mostly in spaces that didn't have obvious room for a trumpet player in his late 60s recording a song about trees and skies and the colors of the rainbow. And yet the song existed, and Armstrong had sung it. And what he had done with it was, as those who heard the recording understood immediately, something that the cultural conversation of 1967 didn't quite have a framework for because it was operating at a different level than what the framework was designed to assess. The song had been written by Bob Thiele and George David Weiss and brought to Armstrong with the specific intention that his voice was the voice it required. Thiele, who produced Armstrong's recordings for ABC, had heard in the song something that he believed Armstrong would understand immediately, a quality of affirmation that was not naive, not sentimental in the cheap sense, but genuine in the way that affirmation is genuine when it comes from someone who has seen enough of the world to know what it costs, and has chosen, anyway, to insist on what is beautiful in it. Armstrong was 66 years old. He had spent 50 years moving through an America that had not always been welcoming, performing in conditions that were frequently difficult, navigating a professional landscape that had been consistently complicated in ways that a man of his background and his era would have understood without needing them explained. He had every reason, by 1967, to produce a more complicated relationship with the idea of a wonderful world than the song seemed to require. He did not. Armstrong's response to the label's decision was characteristically compressed. He was not, by temperament, someone who conducted his disagreements with the music industry in public, and the specific frustration he felt about the American non-release of the song was expressed, when it was expressed at all, in the brief and carefully chosen terms he used for things he considered both important and outside his ability to change. He had made the record. It was right. What the label did with it was the label's business. And the music business had always been the music business, a domain he had been navigating for 40 years and that had never been entirely his to control. What he could control was the record itself, and the record was right. The song's journey into American consciousness came later, and from an unexpected direction. In 1987, the filmmaker Barry Levinson used the recording in his film Good Morning Vietnam, not as background music, not as period atmosphere, but as a structural element of the film's emotional argument, playing over images of the Vietnam War, in a juxtaposition that gave the song a dimension it hadn't had before. The contrast between what the song said and what the images showed produced in audiences who heard it in that context something that the song's original 1967 reception in America had not produced. America encountered the record 20 years late in a room that made it possible to hear what Armstrong had been singing about. Not naive affirmation, but affirmation in the face of its opposite, which is a more difficult and more valuable thing. Bob Thiele, the producer who had brought the song to Armstrong and who had believed in it when the label president did not, spoke about the eventual American recognition of the recording with the particular quality of satisfaction that comes from having been right in a way that took longer than expected to be confirmed. He said that what he had always known about the song was that it required a specific voice. Not a beautiful voice in the conventional sense, but a voice that had earned the right to say what the song said. A voice that had been enough places and done enough things and seen enough of the world that when it told you there were trees of green and red roses too, you believed it, because you could hear in the voice the knowledge of what else there was alongside the trees and the roses. The recording session itself was, by the accounts of those who were there, unremarkable in the technical sense. The arrangements were prepared. The musicians were experienced. The process moved with the efficiency of a producer and a performer who had worked together enough times to have developed a shared understanding of what they were trying to do. What was remarkable was what came through the microphone. Armstrong's voice by 1967 was not what it had been in 1928 or 1938 or even 1957. The years and the miles and the physical demands of the trumpet had left their marks on the instrument that his voice was. It was rougher, smaller in its range, more worn in its textures. And it was, for these reasons, more capable of carrying what the song required. The quality of someone who has been through enough to know the cost of things, and who is choosing, with full knowledge of that cost, to tell you that there is still something worth looking at. The roughness was not a limitation. It was the evidence. Larry Newton's decision not to promote the record in the United States was communicated to Armstrong through the usual channels of the music industry, through managers and producers rather than directly, in the way that commercial decisions are usually communicated when the person delivering them is aware that the person receiving them is unlikely to be pleased. The reasons given were the reasons Newton had: the market, the timing, the age of the performer relative to what the market wanted. The record was released in America in a minimal way, pressed, technically available, but without the promotional infrastructure that would have made it something the American public was likely to encounter. In the United Kingdom, the record was released with full promotional support. It went to #1 within weeks. The response across Europe and the United Kingdom was of the kind that music industry executives describe, after the fact, as unexpected, a word that, in this context, means something more like unaccounted for in the calculations that had seemed correct at the time. The song reached people, not in the way that commercially targeted records reach people, not through the mechanisms of market penetration and demographic alignment, but in the way that certain things reach people when they find the part of a person that demographic analysis doesn't know how to locate. It was on the radio in homes and shops, and the kind of ordinary public spaces where music arrives at people who are not specifically looking for it. And in those spaces, what people heard was an old man's rough and honest voice telling them something true about the world, and finding, to their surprise, that they believed him. What the story of the recording reveals about Louis Armstrong is something that his public image, the broad smile, the warmth, The quality of easy generosity that audiences had been receiving from him for 50 years sometimes made it difficult to see. He was not a man who simply produced what the market wanted. He was a musician with a precise and confident understanding of what the music required, and he acted on that understanding even when the commercial environment around him was making a different assessment. He had spent 50 years operating in an industry that had frequently had different ideas about what he should be doing than he did, and he had navigated that gap with the particular combination of grace and stubbornness that allowed him to be, simultaneously, one of the most commercially successful performers in American popular music and one of the most artistically uncompromising. The record that Larry Newton declined to promote in 1967 became, in the decades that followed, the recording most immediately associated with Armstrong's name by people who came to his work after his death. For listeners who had not been there for the Hot Five sessions in 1928, who had not seen the all-stars in the clubs of the 1950s, who knew Armstrong's name from the records that survived him, this was often the record they knew first. The rough voice, the simple melody, the quality of honest affirmation that the song contained, these reached people across decades and across the distances of culture and language and history in the way that certain recordings reach people. Not because of promotional infrastructure, because of what was in the voice. Larry Newton was a commercially rational man making commercially rational decisions in 1967. The market, as he understood it, did not want what Armstrong was selling. He was not wrong about the market. He was wrong about the song. The difference between those two things is the difference between what the industry is designed to measure and what the music is designed to carry. Armstrong understood this difference, had always understood it, and had spent 50 years operating in the gap between them with a faith in the music that the industry's calculations never quite accounted for. In 1967, Louis Armstrong sat in a recording studio in New York and recorded a song about trees and skies and the colors of the rainbow and the faces of people going by. The label president said nobody would listen. The song has been in continuous circulation ever since. It has been heard in more rooms, on more occasions, by more people than Larry Newton's commercial calculations had room for. Which is exactly what Armstrong knew would happen. Which is exactly why he recorded it anyway.